So in the second video, we're going to talk about a central idea in Kant's moral philosophy, and that is the idea of the categorical imperative. This is a really remarkable idea because Kant thinks that the categorical imperative allows us to know, as he puts it, very well how to distinguish in every case that comes up what is good and what is evil. He says that on page 489. So Kant is saying that because we have reason, we can always know what our duty is. We can always know what the right thing to do is. That's what the categorical imperative shows us. He says it's a canon at one point. On page 494, he describes it as a canon, by which he means it's a rule or a measure. It's a standard for what is right. Now, an imperative is a command. It's an order. So in grammar, we use that term, an imperative, to refer to a command. So if I say, close the door, or turn off your computers, I'm issuing a command. And Kant distinguishes between two types of these commands or imperatives. There are hypothetical imperatives, and there are categorical imperatives. And it's the categorical imperative that tells us what is right. Hypothetical imperatives instead tell us what to do if we want to pursue some goal or purpose. Now these are good things. For instance, if you want to get an A in a class, you need to do the reading. Or if you want your car to run well, you need to change your oil. Those are hypothetical imperatives. So if you want to pursue this end, an A in the class, or well-maintained car, then you need to do this. That word if is what makes it hypothetical. It's conditional. If you want to pursue this end, then you need to do this. So hypothetical imperative is an action that is a means to some other end. A categorical imperative, on the other hand, does not have some good outside itself. It's good in itself. So it's not something you need to do if you want to achieve some other good thing. The categorical imperative concerns actions that are good in themselves. It concerns something that's a duty. It's obligatory, necessary, and thus categorical. So categorical means absolute, unconditional, unqualified, without exceptions. And because it's without exceptions, that means it's universally valid. That is, it applies to all people, in all places, and at all times. So Kant has a few different formulations of the categorical imperative. The main one shows up on page 493, where he writes that the categorical imperative is to act only in accordance with that maxim, through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So remember, a maxim is the principle of the will, principle of the decision or choice or action. And so Kant gives a few examples of what that looks like. Suppose you owe money to some dangerous character, and you say, okay, I need to get this money. Somehow I'm going to lie to my friend and tell him that I can pay him back if he'll lend me this money. And so the friend lends you the money, you pay off this dangerous loan shark, and you might think, well, that was good. Now I'm out of danger. Well, Kant would say, okay, well, what was the principle of that action? If that's what you're thinking of doing, what's the principle of that action? And it would be something like, if I'm in danger, it's okay to lie to get out of trouble. And Kant would say, okay, well, let's try to universalize that principle. You might think that your situation is the exception, but what if that became the rule? Whenever someone was in danger, they had to lie about it to get out of trouble. Could we consistently will that would become a universal law? So anytime someone was in danger, they should lie. Kant would say, no, we'd never want that because we'd never be able to trust anyone. And so that gives us an indication that that's the wrong thing to do. he, later on that page, then writes, is kind of upping it a little bit by saying that the categorical imperative is to act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature. So not just the law of what people ought to do, but what happened all the time. Could you imagine a situation in which danger always made people lie? Would we want to live in a world like that? No. It would make it impossible to live together. And so this is why he says, if you can't consistently will that your maxim should be universalized, then you have a clear indication that that's wrong. Now he has a second formulation of the categorical imperative, and this focuses on the fact that we are rational beings. Okay, so as rational beings, we have these duties, and this applies to all rational beings. We have these duties, but the flip side of duty is rights. So this also means that all rational beings not only have duties, but rights. And so whenever we're acting in relation to other people, or even to ourselves, we need to recognize the rights of those people. So act that you use humanity, whether in your own person, in relation to yourself, or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. It's on page 496. So what does that mean? To use someone as a means means that we're using them. We're treating them just as a means to some other end. So if I use a person for their car, I'm not really considering them as a person. I'm just using them to drive me around. And we recognize that there's something wrong with that, to use people in that way, to treat them just as a means to our own end. Instead, we should always recognize other people as ends in themselves, deserving an intrinsic respect, bearing an intrinsic dignity. And so whenever we act, we should always consider, are we treating other people, or are we treating ourselves as a means, or as an end in themselves? So this is Kant's argument against suicide even, that in some way this is a failure to recognize the duty that one has to oneself as a rational being. It's not treating oneself as an end in oneself. So this would apply to all rational nature. Hypothetically, if there were alien life forms, it wouldn't just apply to humans, it would apply to Vulcans and Wookiees, even predators. Now, the Vulcans and Wookiees are better at recognizing others in this way, but predators, if you've seen those movies, and you probably know that they tend not to view all rational natures as ends in themselves, but some, like human beings, as a means. They're just an object to hunt. So this raises this important distinction in Kant between things and persons. And the difference between things and persons is that things lack reason and as a result only have relative worth. So things could include minerals, rocks, things that we make, like computers or water bottles, but also plants and animals he still considers as things. They only have relative worth, and they can have a price. We can buy those things. With human beings, though, because they have reason, and all rational natures have an absolute worth. So instead of having a price, they have dignity, and they deserve respect as bearers of this intrinsic dignity. They have an absolute worth. So this is this principle that rational nature exists as an end in itself. Now finally, Kant offers a third formulation of the categorical imperative, which I'll just comment on briefly because he doesn't talk about it as much. But this is the basis of autonomy. Autonomy literally means giving the law to oneself, self-legislating. And so in 497, he describes this as the idea of the will of every rational being as a will giving universal law. So rational beings are autonomous in the sense that they're capable of self-legislation or giving the law to themselves. Now that doesn't mean that they're just making up the law for themselves, because reason is universal and the moral law is universal, so it's binding on everyone in the same way. So what reason does is not make up the law, but it allows us to recognize the law and to apply that law to ourselves. And that autonomy is part of the dignity of being human, and that we're capable of self-legislation in that way.